Hello, you've tuned into a special Himal Southasian conversation about the election in Bangladesh this week. I'm Nayantara Narayanan, coming to you this time from Trivandrum in the South Indian state of Kerala. On the 12th of February, Bangladesh will hold its first election since the revolution in 2024, the one that toppled Sheikh Hasina as prime minister and ended her more than 16-year autocratic rule. An interim government has taken over the reins since then and it's trying to make way for a democratic transition to an elected government. On the show today, we have journalists from Dhaka who have been closely covering politics and events on the ground since before the monsoon revolution in July 2024. But I'm also joined from Kathmandu by Himal's editor, Roman Gautam. Hi, Roman. Good to see you here.
Hi, Nayantara. Lovely to see you too.
So let's just quickly set the stage for our viewers. This is, of course, an important election because it's the first one since that popular uprising that led to the fall of Sheikh Hasina's government, that led to her fleeing the country. But there have been several developments since then that, there have been several changes in the state of Bangladesh politics since then. So this has become an important election for more reasons than one. Could you quickly take us through what those changes and what those reasons are, what we should be looking out for?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also maybe to frame this, I think within the perspective that I think a lot of Himal's readers will be taking on this as well is, I mean, I think it's no exaggeration to say certainly the eyes of South Asia and beyond that, really the eyes of the world are really on Bangladesh now, right? Where as we're recording, we're just a couple of days away really from the election. There's so many questions I think everyone is wondering about. At Himal, we've been talking about the fate of the July revolution or the monsoon revolution, however you want to call it. And I think that's something that will be of enormous consequence to all of us. And there's so much to unpack. I think, the interim government in Bangladesh, to what extent has it succeeded in all the reforms that it promised? The reforms, how do they exist on paper and how do they exist on practice? The student movement that really was the spark for the revolution as well. It seems to have, I think, from many perspectives, kind of lost its way on its journey into organized politics. I think a lot of people were unpleasantly surprised by their tie-up with the Islamist parties, which again raises so many questions about Bangladesh's past. Of course, it raises a very important question about women's rights and position within Bangladesh's politics going forward. There's also the question of the BNP. I mean, there's so much of Bangladesh's history that comes into this. What is the BNP at this point is also, I think, a mystery that many people are trying to fathom, given all the changes that there have been both within the party and within Bangladesh. And I think really the big picture question is how much of a change does this really bring? I mean, Bangladesh, like many other countries, I think has had some false dawns in the past. I think that those of us who look at South Asia and Bangladesh with a great deal of sympathy and empathy and hope would like to think that this is really a real change away from the old patterns of authoritarianism, of military involvement in politics, of control of the media, of curbs on freedom of expression and the rights of women and minorities. And this election is absolutely pivotal to all of that, which is why I think I mean, that's why we're here to have this conversation today with Zyma and Nusmila. I couldn't imagine a better duo of people to walk us through this. But yeah, I think that's what South Asia is looking at.
Right, and at Himal, we're running a series of stories on this election, on this rebranding of Islamist politics, on what's happened to women since the Monsoon Revolution. They've really been sidelined in mainstream politics in the country. And even what the fate of the Rohingya might be under a new government. So you can find all that and more on our website, himalmag.com. But let me quickly introduce our two guest speakers from Dhaka. We're joined by Zyma Islam, who's a senior reporter at the Daily Star, and Nusmila Lohani, deputy editor at Netra News. Zyma, Nusmila, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah.
Zyma, let me start with you. First of all, do you think that this can be, that this will be a free and fair election? And what do you expect? Expect people to, kind of turn out in large numbers? Is that spirit of the July 2024 movement still there? That'll propel people to voting booths? Or do you think there's some disillusionment with the politics of the last few months?
Thank you for the question. When you're planning a big wedding, I don't know if anyone's ever done that, but when you're planning a big wedding and like the last 2 or 3 days before the wedding, the sort of energy, the vibe, the electricity that's in the air, the nerves, the butterflies, all of that, it's a little like that at the moment. There are um, people who I've never really seen talking about politics or engaging in politics who are now actively trying to find out who they will be voting for in 3 days' time. And then I want you to remember that for a large part, the voters turning up in polling booths will be people who have never voted ever in their life. This includes me. So this is a generation who they became adults during the regime of Sheikh Hasina, regime of Awami League, and we never had a fair election, or we found that our votes were cast when we turned up at the polling booths. So I think that, you're doing something for the first time in your life, regardless of whether or not that makes a real and lasting change, it's still an exciting thing to do. There are influencers who are pushing out content on what to do right before voting day, how to find your polling center. And, this is Gen Z. This is the youngest cohort of the Gen Z who haven't really necessarily been seen as much in politics. I mean, of course, they were there in the July uprising and in the revolution, but beyond that, you don't really see these voices talking about important political discourse. So I think it's very refreshing, the sort of energy that's sort of in the air at the moment. It's like one big party. Having said all of that, I do think that, beneath the energy, the electricity, there is some disillusionment about the fact that the aspirations that led to the revolution did not really materialize in a solid way for a lot of people. Of course, we had some good changes, we had some very lasting reforms, but at the same time, this was a movement which started based on the concept of a non-discriminatory society. And discrimination really seems to be the sort of key over encompassing theme at the moment.
Nusmila, I mean, of course, the Awami League has been banned from the election, and the international tribunal has sentenced Sheikh Hasina to death. But I was just wondering what the conversation has been in Dhaka or other parts of the country about the party, and is there any talk about them at all?
I think there are certainly some hotspots across the country which has the conversation is riveting there in terms of talking about Awami League. So we have a place, we have a constituency called Gopalganj. We have a belt called, which are Madaripur, Shoriatpur, Faridpur. These are places where the Awami League vote banks are concentrated. So when our reporters went out for ground level reporting there, these you can see these places, and they kind of mirror some specifically. If I were to speak about Gopalganj, you can go walk through Gopalganj, you can speak to the voters, and it is something that doesn't mirror anything like the rest of the country, and it is extremely unique because it feels very alienated, the space, from our reporting or again from other reporting. What is being found at the ground level is that most people there, they're kind of, they are talking about Awami League. They are talking about they won't be going to the polls because Awami League is not there. A huge majority of the people that we spoke to did say that. They're also talking about, we will vote whoever comes to the ballot. We're also saying in these the areas that I've mentioned, we are also seeing, Jamaat kind of um, rising up to the occasion, getting those vote banks as well. So to answer your question, for sure, there are parts of the country that Awami League is still very much in the conversation, because those are the concentrated hotspots across the country. So, yeah.
Zyma, maybe if I can also bat a question over to you. Nusmila was talking about the Awami League. Of course, the other classic protagonist in Bangladesh's politics is the BNP. Expected to be the front runner by all accounts, at least that we have been receiving outside the country. I think also riding a big wave of nostalgia, I think, and sympathy perhaps after Khaleda Zia's death late last year. So I guess the question is, what do you think the BNP's prospects really are, especially with what Nusmila was saying, with the Jamaat also seeming to be riding high? And also, what can we expect of the BNP? I mean, there's been, of course, the July Revolution, there's been Khaleda Zia's passing. There's been the break of what in the past was a tie between the BNP and the Jamaat. Being in Dhaka, what does it look like to you in terms of what this BNP that's emerging is looking like?
So we're not expecting a landslide victory for the BNP. And that we are definitely not expecting. I think Bangladesh, if you look at our voting history, you'll find that in a large number of the constituencies, right, or in most constituencies, the population was always split between BNP and Awami League, where one candidate, the Awami League candidate, would get 40% and the BNP candidate would get 60%. It would be a very close race, a very close call, and that's always been like the defining nature of races here, and we are probably going to be seeing some of the very same. Except this time it's going to be the BNP and Jamaat Islami. So the shift has occurred like this. BNP has now taken Awami League's place, and Jamaat Islami has now taken BNP's place in terms of where they lie in the spectrum of politics. And Nusmila was talking about how there are these like very hardcore Awami League voters who are not going to be going to vote. They are still they still want Awami League in the races. A significant number of them will still be going for the next best option, which is, for a lot of them, it will probably be BNP. I'm extrapolating from the fact that they supported Awami League because it was a more left-leaning party. So they will be now going for the more progressive, more moderate option out there. We actually did a very interesting sort of investigation into social media discourse and which party is attacking whom on social media. And what we found out is that Awami League social media users attack Jamaat on social media, and Jamaati social media users attack BNP. So that sort of shows who the Awami League thinks is their opponent, who Jamaat thinks is their opponent. Jamaat does not attack Awami League. Awami League does not attack BNP. And so it was a very sort of strange and I think illuminating finding that we had when we did that analysis. And that's definitely going to be a defining sort of characteristic of the elections going forward. BNP, of course, is riding on a lot of nostalgia because time heals everything. A lot of people have either were very young when BNP was last in power, for example, me, or they have in many ways forgotten what the BNP era was like, because the subsequent Awami League era was just so terrible that a lot of the crimes have often been, I think, in many ways washed away by time. And then added to that is the fact that it's not being led by Tariq Rahman, who is a very fresh face. You've never really seen him lead the political party, and he's bringing a lot of new, progressive, almost westernized energy into the party. He's using the same political body language that a lot of progressive Western politicians use. He's fielding his young, educated daughter into campaigns. She's going to these events where they're talking about women's rights, and she's saying all the right things. So there's some sort of saving graces that they have in their pocket at the moment, which I think will be probably helping them in the elections. Whereas Jamaat is appealing more to the population who had been looking for change, who wanted to break out of the BNP Awami League duopoly, and Jamaat is really cashing in on the sentiment of the revolution being a reset.
Understood. And I mean, what you're describing is so fascinating also just in terms of that reconfiguration of kind of the classic lay of the land, right? In Bangladesh politics, you also brought up the question of women's rights, which I think we'll want to go into a little bit more as well, certainly. But Nusmila, I also wanted to just bat that same question over to you. I mean, I think Zyma was describing kind of the new BNP that's emerging, but I guess the question is also, what do we expect of a government led by the BNP, assuming that that's what happens, like Zyma was saying, without a landslide. The BNP will also perhaps need to be tying up and holding hands with others in the political landscape. What do you think could be reasonably expected from a BNP-led government?
How BNP is riding on the nostalgia, that is definitely correct. At the same time, we have to kind of look at the we have to look at the election, and this is to say that the Gen Z population, this huge chunk of voters, they're voting for the first time. So not only that they're voting for this first time, but they really don't remember how bad BNP was in their time when BNP was in power. They don't have memory of that really, right? So like Zyma said, of course, time heals a lot and people have forgotten, sure. So there's that, that is true. While that is true, we also have a fresh batch of voters in this election who are going to the ballot. They don't really know how bad things were during the BNP tenure. I just wanted to add that in. So I think that will definitely play in favor of BNP. Sorry, your question was what to expect. If not a landslide victory, sure. What to expect? What we can expect is, from a BNP-led government, hopefully pluralism. Not really that. Ideally, we hope to expect, or what we hope to gain from a BNP-led government is pluralism. But the alternative is Jamaat coming into power, and what that does is that will strip minority rights, that will strip women's rights, that will give a very different version of Bangladesh. That will give us a very different version of Bangladesh. So what I think my answer would be, a more nuanced Bangladesh, or a more nuanced take on politics from a BNP-led government.
Yeah, Nusmila, I'd like now to expand on exactly that, the Jamaat, and of course, it's not just been the resurgence of the Jamaat since the revolution, since the Monsoon Revolution in 2024. It's also been other Islamist parties. There's been a lot of right-wing rhetoric in politics and the public space. So, I guess like if you were to kind of crystal ball gaze, if the Jamaat was somehow to pull off a win here, what would that mean for Bangladesh going forward? And I guess especially in terms of what happens with women and women's rights. There's been a lot of regressive rhetoric, especially from the Jamaat. They haven't fielded a single woman candidate, saying that they'll leave that to the reserved seats in parliament. But even in general, while women were at the forefront of the Bangla blockade and at the forefront of the students' movement that led to the revolution, they really have been sidelined in politics since then, right? Like not being represented on the National Consensus Commission, and of the almost 1,900 candidates in this election, only about 4% are actually women. What happens if the Jamaat somehow pull, and if the alliance comes to power and What would that mean, especially for women in Bangladesh?
All right. To answer this, I think realistically speaking, if that were to happen, I will get to that part of the question. But what we are seeing on the ground is, I think it's pretty interesting because realistically speaking or practically speaking, Jamaat might not be coming into power. Most likely, they won't be coming to power. BNP would probably not be winning by a landslide victory. That being said, if we are to look at the seats that Jamaat is contesting, they are contesting very strategically. You can look at, let's say, Rangpur. These are places in the northwest. Rangpur, Khul, and Rache. They have selected seats across the country, around like 292 seats they're contesting, and there are 300 seats in the parliament. The Even the way they're contesting, it's very strategic. They have let go, or they're not even contesting for seats that they know they won't win, right? So my take would be, or my understanding, or our understanding would be that they're playing at the level, they are playing, I mean, they're strategically working out this election in a way that they know they won't win it, but they are gunning for the seats that they will win, and they're focusing their campaign, their resources in those areas. For instance, Rangpur, I mentioned, that is a Jatiya Party stronghold. That's another party that doesn't really come up in the news anymore for various reasons, but um, they have planned it out so well that they will be gaining seats and they will have a stronghold. I mean, this will be, even if they don't win, it will be their best electoral performance. Now, when that happens, we're already looking at something that is probably concerning, given the fact that we would like a secular Bangladesh moving forward. Because when that happens, there are 51 parties that are contesting in for this election. You are absolutely correct. There are more far right conservative political parties, Islamist political parties on the ballot as well. Couple of these parties that we have spoken to have said that they denounce Jamaat because they feel like Jamaat is not conservative enough, that they are not in the right path of Islam. So even if Jamaat is gaining traction, which we feel like, is what we will see happen in the election, that means that all of these other, small political faction parties will be gaining more momentum. They will be gaining more confidence. They will be definitely gaining more voice, more muscle power. I mean, I don't mean to say muscle power like literally, but I mean like more figuratively maybe. Um, because after the July uprising, what we saw is, sure, we had like a spate of mob violence attacks, and spate of protests all over the country. Well, not really, but all over like urban city centers. But we also saw like so many attacks on women, and not all of these attacks were, taking place or being conducted by, traditionally Jamaat looking men, which means that, they will come in certain attires, right? So women, to your point that women, what will happen to women's rights, I feel as a woman, and also I think we can say this, yeah, we can probably agree on this, that women will feel, they already feel more at risk. They already feel more like they are under, I mean, threatened in some way or the other, even if Jamaat does not win, because Jamaat will be gaining quite a few seats, and that will earn them attraction, and then that will pave the way for the future of Bangladesh.
Nusmila, thank you for that. And I think, a question, Zyma, maybe starting with you, but again, a question to both of you. I think also the question of the students in all of this, right? I think that one of the big developments has been that the NCP, the party that was born of the student movement, has taken, I think, some surprising twists and turns. Some of them people might say were not so surprising at all. The big one, I think, was the tie-up with Jamaat. So I'm curious also, the hope, of course, was that the students would lead the way away from kind of this secularism cloaked in authoritarianism, if we can call it that, of Hasina's time, There was the much more non-secular nationalism of what the BNP back in the day represented. These guys, I think, were supposed to open up a new path that was neither of those things, right? And I just wanted to ask you both, what's the public perception of the students and of the NCP, given everything that has happened, especially in the last few months?
Of course. So I don't think anyone expected the sort of student-led political party to be a secular party or even a liberal party. This was always a conservative party trying to aim for becoming more of a center. I mean, they were trying to be a centrist party. They didn't really manage to do that, and it was always a sort of an internal tension that existed within the party, where this being a party that it was initially formed by equal blocks of people from the liberal wing and from the conservative wing, the party gradually bled most of its liberal members. And so this party always struggled to say center and always kept going towards the right. So, the fact that they joined Jamaat is not necessarily, it wasn't a surprise in any way. I think that them joining Jamaat was a good thing for the Jamaat. It was a liberalizing a factor for the Jamaat. And for example, the fact that Jamaat did not manage to make an alliance with some of the more far right-wing parties was specifically because NCP as a party believed in having women in leadership positions. It believed in having women lawmakers. It did not believe in women being sidelined. I remember there was this one incident where there was a woman, a female politician from the NCP who was sitting on stage with all of the Jamaat and the other, the male leaders. And that was the day that Islami Andolan Bangladesh, a very far right-wing party, decided to quit the alliance because they're like, we can't have a woman sitting on stage with the men. And so it was definitely a sort of like a liberalizing agent for Jamaat. And I think, what Nusmila was talking about in terms of how it's, we're seeing a lot of very right-wing conversations arise in public discourse. Yes, we are, but I would argue that those conversations or those ideologies were always there. They just never made it out into the public. And then now the fact that they're making it out into the public is because there is an active sort of threat against these very ideologies. And because, you do have a bit of a rise of the progressive voices whenever they see, for example, Jamaat saying that a woman can't be the prime minister, the progressive voices are roaring back. And then you see a sort of outpouring of conservative emotion in response to that. So it's not like, it's not like people have suddenly gotten more conservative. I would argue that they were always conservative. It's just getting out into the open at the moment, which is a healthy thing to happen.
Yeah, thanks, Zyma. And, I'd like to remind all our viewers to visit the Himal website, that's himalmac.com, and read the political scientist Naveen Mursheed's piece up there, which really lays out how even in, even paths to democratic renewal, how they remain deeply gendered and unfair to women, as Bangladesh is clearly demonstrating at this point. But Nusmila, the same question to you. What is this moment telling us?
Again, what Zyma said earlier, that is true that before pre-July uprising in Bangladesh, the two major parties were Awami League and BNP. Now, BNP has taken the place of Awami League, and then Jamaat has taken the place of BNP. Now, back in the day, I mean, pre-July uprising, BNP was looked at as the conservative party, and Awami League was the secular party. Those were their branding. Those were the political branding. That's what they kind of carried. They didn't really. That's the brand image basically of the political party, and that's the vote bank that they gunned for. Now, when BNP, now that BNP is the front runner, we understand that. And it is true that, we overall, you can say that Bangladesh as a society, overall, and that includes rural areas, not just Dhaka, other cities as well. Sure, it can be argued and it can be said that we have always been conservative. This is not something new, but we have been conservative in line of, let's say, what BNP stands for in terms of being conservative, not what Jamaat stands for in terms of being conservative. Am I making sense? Because I'm trying to say that what Jamaat brings to the table, that branding of conservatism, that's not new, or that's not really, that widespread across the country. Sorry, that is new, and that is not what is common across the country. That's the point that I'm trying to make. When we step outside of Dhaka or the urban cities, if you go into the rural areas of Bangladesh, the grassroots levels, you will see more women in hijab. Now you'll see even more, perhaps. But again, all of those women, in most cases, not all, in most cases, all of those women and all of those hijab or what have you, was aligned or in tune with the brand of conservatism that BNP brought to the table, not Jamaat. So that's where I think is new right now. And in the last 18 months, I think it has been, since the uprising or the interim government being installed, about 18 months, 18 months yesterday, then the interim government was installed. The the moment that we're standing in, it's very interesting because it feels like a political shift is in the making.
Zyma, one more question that we really wanted to ask you, though, of course, Nusmila, we would want to hear you on this as well, is really where things stand in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of the press. Of course, Zyma, you are one of the people who was unfortunately and terrifyingly there when there was a mob attack towards the end of last year on the offices of Prothomalo and Daily Star. I think you were one of the people who was stuck on the roof as the building was set on fire. Really shocking, and I think still something I think that sent shockwaves across the journalistic fraternity within Bangladesh and far beyond. Off the record sometimes even more openly, I've heard some journalists in Bangladesh also talking possibly about rising threats from Islamist actors. Certainly, the perception of that threat is rising from what I've been hearing. But I wanted to just throw that across to you to hear what your sense is. I mean, both with this moment, coming up to the election. What has been the situation of press freedom in this interim period under the interim government compared to what it was under the Awami League? And what's the anticipation of what comes next?
The anticipation of what comes next, more of the same. The aggressors against freedom of expression, against having an independent media industry, they're still here. It's just that the faces have changed. Previously, you had a government which carried out state-sponsored attacks on freedom of expression, which carried out state-sponsored attacks on independent media. And that has sort of just changed into there being this very right-wing fundamentalist force, which has attacked media, as we have seen with the attacks on my organization and that on Prothomalo, and which will be carrying out attacks in the future. There is no reason to think that this is the first attack. In fact, this is only the beginning. We will be, anytime in media refuses to toe the line, they will be running the risk of getting their buildings stormed into, of having their journalists trapped inside, of having their organizations set on fire, destroyed, because that's the rhetoric that we see on social media on a daily basis. And even after the attack, it's not like the amount of people decrying the attack, the amount of people criticizing the attack is countered by a much larger force asking for the destruction of media organizations. No government has ever wanted a free media. I think that we have to really accept. And similarly, no political party wants a free media. Everyone wants a media that's obedient to their ideologies, to their wishes. And, previously we had to be afraid of the Secret Service walking into our office, picking us up, the Secret Service calling us and making threatening, leveling threats. And that has sort of changed into people setting us on fire. That's really the only change that has happened. We are still under attack. And I just wanted to say that when it comes to freedom of expression in Bangladesh or free media, we are never, it's never really like a war zone. It's not like conflict reporting here. But we've always known that we're at risk. We've always known that we can be either arrested, detained, picked up, or at the moment attacked at any point in time. And that, I think, is just going to exacerbate in the coming days. We've been making decisions based on how we are perceiving the safety of the organization at the moment. And some of these decisions do end up impacting, I think, our editorial stance, do end up impacting our editorial judgment. And that's not a fair decision for any journalist to make. Do I want to think about the life and the safety of my colleagues here, or do I want to run this story? And I could make these decisions a lot easily in the past, because oftentimes it was just my own life I had to worry about, and that's no longer the case. And I have to worry about all my colleagues. That's not fair on me.
Yeah, that's absolutely not fair. And yeah, it's sad that that is still the reality. I think all the more reason for all of us from the rest of South Asia and the world to be watching Bangladesh very closely. Of course, immense solidarity and power to you guys at Prathamalo and Daily Star, one of the very few organizations that has continued to, I think, fight at least as much as possible within what was under Hasina and Nusmila as well. I mean, Netra News, another one of those organizations that has also fought, I think, tooth and nail to be able to hold the line for media freedom in Bangladesh. Of course, Netra News was also forced out and into exile for many years. Recently, as part of this transition and interim period, Netra News has come back into Bangladesh. But again, I think that the situation on the ground is far from ideal. Was just wondering if you could give us a little bit of what you're seeing and hearing as well.
I think what we're missing there in that discourse is that the one geopolitical aspect, and that is the sentiment, the anti-India sentiment that really fueled that mob violence. So Osman Hadi, who was earlier shot, he went through an attempt of assassination. He was a member of Inqilab Moncho, which is something that came about after the July uprising. So he was a prominent student leader, and he went through an attempt of assassination, and then he was hospitalized. When he died, by the time he died, or by the time he was hospitalized, it was very quickly established that the Awami League, the ousted government, and members of the Awami League, they were behind that assassination. So this played a huge factor behind what happened on the night of, I think it was December 18th, because when the news broke that Hadi passed away, there was this uproar and mob violence. Now, Daily Star and Prathamalo, these legacy newspapers, they were tagged as agents of India. And this was not, it didn't happen overnight. They have been tagged as agents of India from way earlier, right? But only in peak moments of upheaval does that narrative get propagated, fueled, amplified. And then what we saw was definitely unprecedented. But what we also at the same time forget is it was definitely mob violence, but it also had that anti-India sentiment attached to it. And that brings us to the geopolitical element in all of this, in this landscape that we are standing in right now, politically speaking. That is, Awami League has this attachment, or has this, what should I say, tied up with India. Whichever government comes to power in this election, the voters do not want to see that quote unquote India hegemony taking place, because the consensus is, I shouldn't say the consensus, but a huge, a large number of the voters feel as though that Bangladesh has been ruled under India hegemony through the Awami League. So there is a geopolitical element here that's at play. Now, BNP is seen as more inclined towards Pakistan, or at least that was the idea pre-July uprising, because again, BNP was understood as the conservative party. When you're conservative, the religion factor comes in, and then you get tied in with the other Muslim majority country in South Asia, and that's Pakistan. We have a history with Pakistan. Now, Jamaat is playing definitely a strategic role here as well. By that I mean, Tariq Rahman has made a public statement. He said that he's willing to make alliance or partner with any South Asian, or anyone really, any other country who will see the benefit of Bangladesh, in the benefit of Bangladesh. So he's not choosing sides. It's not outright saying, I'm not going to partner with India, but I'm going to partner with Pakistan. He's not saying that. But we, at the same time, we know that Jamaat is more inclined, if we are to take their, the fact that they're conservative, so they would be more inclined with Pakistan. But at the same time, Jamaat had also, the student leader, not the student leader, the student wing of Jamaat, they have met with the Chinese diplomats. China is also like a big player in this region. We don't really talk about it. We do talk about it, but not as much, in the sense that, it kind of transcends that South Asia bloc. But there's India, there's China, there's also Pakistan. So I feel as though in this election, whoever is coming to power, it is at this point kind of understood who is coming to power. But this election will also kind of decide the foreign policy direction that Bangladesh will be taking. And that also plays into that whole element of how conservative the policy making, national reforms will be or will not be, because that's how we kind of understood that India meant secularism, or India meant anti-conservative policies to that effect. Yeah.
Absolutely no, and Nusmila, just one of the more stupefying facts I think of everything that's happened in Bangladesh over the last 2 years or so is that Bangladesh and Pakistan are now almost besties, which, given the history there, my God, right? Life surprises you. And yeah, I think thank you for that. I think that, of course, the geopolitical element here is enormously important. I think that certainly massive implications for South Asia. I mean, India was trying to kind of look east and forget that Pakistan exists in its approach to regionalism, which made sense for as long as Awami League was in charge in Dhaka, but now I think is going to have to be rethought. Anyway, that's a different conversation.
Right.
But I did
Yeah.
want to
Right.
just briefly ask, in terms of what happens with Hasina, and how much how much of a liability that might be for India. Now, of course, Hasina sentenced to death by a court in Bangladesh, but currently living in Delhi, almost like a caged bird. New Delhi seems to let her out once in a while to sing a tune. I know that happened not so long ago, where she was let loose, so to speak, at the Delhi Press Club. I'm curious, from the first days of the post-uprising moment to now, what is the perception of Hasina, but also India specifically in all this, and also of the Indian media, which I know has been a significant factor in shaping Bangladeshi opinion on India as well?
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely. There has been a roller coaster for one, because over the past 18 months, what had happened is that right off the bat, after the uprising, after she fled, after the former prime minister, she fled, the government is toppled. For about 3 days, Bangladesh was without even an interim government. So we were kind of like, on our own, so to speak. And then the interim government becomes installed. But even starting, I think, mid-August, if not even earlier, India's media, of course, did play a huge role in the propaganda, because we remember seeing stuff like calls to save Hindus in Bangladesh, and then saying that there is a Hindu genocide going on in Bangladesh. Now, it was extremely tricky because at the same time we did have communal violence. There were deaths, there were looting, there were deaths, not just in August, but then in the months following. In fact, even recently we had a Hindu man lynched and then burned. The body was set to fire, right? That happened, if I'm not mistaken, sometime in December. So these things are real. There's no reason for us to kind of not talk about it. There's no reason for us to kind of like shove this aside, which the interim government has spectacularly failed to do. They have never addressed it directly. They have always blamed the Awami League. They always blame not just the Awami League, but they blame the Indian media for blowing things out of proportion. But the fact remained that there was communal violence on the ground level, just not to the extent, thankfully, not to the extent or scale as what the India media claimed. At the same time, what was happening, and at least in the last 6 months, or if not even earlier, when Sheikh Hasina, if not herself, her son was giving interviews to international media, especially Indian media, by the way, which they did publish, like interviews, right? If not written interviews in print or televised interviews of Joy, Sheikh Hasina's son. It always came down to the fact that they are calling for peace, that they want democracy and stuff like that. But at the same time, we actually even have these call recordings, and they have been verified as to not to be manipulated, so they are authentic, or at least that's the understanding from the reports. We have call recordings where Sheikh Hasina is making calls to her loyalists and followers in Bangladesh at the time. They're probably still here, and she is asking for vengeance, and she is asking, going out, on these calls, she's not going out. On these calls, she's asking that, they burned down Botish number 32 number, which is her her family home, right? The museum. You go out and you burn their houses as well. They killed our men, you go and you kill more, an eye for an eye. I think we didn't report on this as well. So we had two narratives playing out, one on the ground level where you have the ousted former prime minister making calls to her loyalists and urging them to go out and go out for blood. And then you have the international media, specifically the Indian media, where you're reading all of these interviews where she's calling for peace and return to the homeland because she wants to make peace. So
Nusmila, one last very quick question. Along
Sure.
with this election, the referendum on the July Charter is also being held. How important is it that this referendum be passed?
Right. So this would be the first time that we ever have something like that on the election day. So that's pretty, that's historic as is. We are the understanding is that it will pass, because as our track record shows that if we are asked to vote yes or no, we kind of lean towards yes. That's just the track record. This was the first time it's been done on the election day itself. That being said, BNP's Tariq Rahman did support, or did say that we should vote yes, but I feel I feel as though he had done it more reluctantly, which made it probably more problematic for the local BNP leaders to campaign against it. Jamaat definitely campaigns against it. Um, I think when it comes to how important it is for it to pass, I think realistically speaking, it will pass. That is just the understanding. But they have simplified a lot of complex issues into one referendum and making it into a yes or no question, right? So either you say yes, and that means that you are saying yes to all of these reforms, which will see reforms in legislature, that the term a prime minister has, and a bunch of other stuff which are extremely complex. So the critique is that it's too simplified. It is important that it passes, but honestly speaking, I guess I don't have much to say on this except for the fact that it has been simplified into something it shouldn't have been done like this. But again, at the same time, the understanding is it will pass. We will see a yes on the referendum on election day.
Zyma, Islam, Nusmila, Lohani, thank you so much for being here for this very important and very illuminating conversation. And yes, we'll keep an eye on what happens in the Bangladesh election, and I'm sure we'll speak to you again in the near future about which way Bangladesh is heading. Thanks so much for making the time today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So that's quite a lot to think about on Bangladesh. But Roman, we have another post-revolution election coming up in less than a month, and that's in Nepal, where you are. Would you like to, give us a quick preview? What are the issues that people are talking about? What are the big concerns there?
I mean, that's a massive question, and I think that if you really get me going on this, I'm going to talk everyone's ears off and probably bore you. But I will say that I think we're definitely going to have coverage coming up on this on the Himal website. So please follow us and follow us on social, etc. Come to the Himal Mag website. We will try and make sense of the Nepal election for everyone, just as we are trying to do with Bangladesh. Of course, it's been election season. I think we also had the Myanmar election that Himal has also carried a bunch of good pieces on. So I think for Bangladesh and then for Nepal, the big question is, after the uprising and the revolution, how much changes, how much stays the same? I think that Sri Lanka has had now, I think its transition more or less complete. Some things are new, some things are old. But I think at least in Sri Lanka, there's been stability. I think that, in Bangladesh, for all of the very many difficult questions that we were just discussing, the hope again, I think, has to be that there is at least some kind of stability that the country can build on. And I think in Nepal as well, we are going to be trying to figure out how much of the old survives amid all of these changes. I think the remarkable thing is that in all three countries, after all the upheaval, we're still going to end, knock on wood, with 3 fair democratic elections, which I think for just for the history of Southasia is an encouraging sign. Hopefully that's how it stays. So yeah, I think Nepal votes early March, if all goes to schedule, which it should. So please watch what we are doing. And also, of course, please support what we are doing. I mean, Himal is able to do all of this coverage on Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and all the rest of South Asia, and able to do it completely independently because we don't depend on any corporate advertising. We don't depend on any government funding. We are independent. We are South Asians doing this for you as South Asians and South Asia watchers. And we really need your help to keep the lights on and keep the magazine going and growing. So please become a Himal patron. We have a program that allows you as a reader to support us and join the Himal patron community. Please consider doing that. We will put a link in the episode notes wherever possible. And also, of course, you can find the support us link on himalmag.com.
That's right. So thanks, Roman, for joining me from Kathmandu. And that's a wrap on this conversation. But do come back to himalmag.com for post-election analysis on Bangladesh and much more. See you soon.